Welcome to the Get Psychological podcast, your place to find a bridge between the consulting room, the university setting, and the real world of what you guys are actually struggling with on a day-to-day basis. My name is Dr. Douglas Sedownik. I'm so excited to have you here. I have a special guest, Kellum Lewis, who is a licensed psychotherapist. And this is part of a series of conversations Kellum and I are going to be having about the relationship between the psyche and the world of politics, which is very, very exciting. And I'm so excited to be having guests here on the Get Psychological podcast. We have some interesting news today. Today is the day that the news dropped that finally Biden is dropping out of the race and he endorsed Kamala Harris. But without further ado, let me welcome you and let me welcome Kellum. And Kellum, let us let the audience know a little bit about yourself.
Sure. Thank you, Doug. Thanks so much for inviting me on and having this great idea that we maybe have a discussion, a dialogue around both things that are political and especially at a time when democracy seems threatened, at least, and also to try to relate that to how it is to be a psychological person in the world and helping clients and maybe students and all of that develop their own psychology. So yeah, I'm Kellum Lewis, and I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist in Pasadena, California, and also an ecotherapist, which has some bearing. We'll get into that at some point too, probably, and also a gay affirmative, gay-centered therapist, and yeah, that's it. Happy to be here.
That's fantastic. I think there's already a bunch of things to discuss, which is how is it that Kellum and I maybe are a different kind of psychotherapist. I think people tend to think of the cliche of psychotherapists as people who only work behind closed doors. And Kellum and I are uniquely proud of the fact that we're activists. And Kellum also mentioned ecotherapy. So that might be interesting to also be an activist for the earth as well. And but also maybe another thread is we were thinking before the news of the election change that there was a very interesting series on Netflix. I think it was about Hitler and what was it called? Hitler and something evil. And we had watching it. It was almost as if the Netflix special was tailor-made for people who are concerned about the threat to democracy represented by the election of Donald Trump and now his VP pick, the hillbilly corporate guy. so much for being a hillbilly. Apparently he was supported by the wealthiest man in the country, Peter Thiel, who has some very strange ideas about what we should really get rid of. Anyway, I won't get too distracted, but Kellum, help us understand a little bit, why we wanted to talk about that Netflix I think it's a 4-part series, and maybe what the viewers could look forward to in terms of what we're going to talk about vis-a-vis the politics.
Yeah. By the way, I think it was called Hitler and the Nazis, Evil on Trial, because it sort of used the Nuremberg trial as sort of the framework for everything.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. Well, what struck me, I guess, right off the bat were the similarities that were being brought out by a lot of the interviewers between Hitler and his regime and his rhetoric and the current day and the current the previous administration of Trump, and how it sort of has he sort of doubled down, it sounds like, in a lot of ways in terms of, or really increase the rhetoric around retribution and getting rid of enemies of the state and that sort of thing. And so much of that just rang so true rang so similar, listening to Hitler's rhetoric. So for me, it just seemed really important to try to have a conversation about that, try to get people involved in a conversation where we're looking at, are we repeating history here? Are we, and if we are we doing it blindly? Is it inevitable? is this just how things go, or is there a way to stem that tide, change things around, do something different? And one of the reasons I'm excited to talk to you, Doug, is I know that you have been very strong in always trying to get a message out about the political is psychological, the personal is political, the political is psychological. And that really resonates with me, is that what's happening inside of our psyches is on full display out in the world. And so, and a lot of times I know, talking to clients, and myself included, sometimes I feel a little discouraged or overwhelmed or hopeless. And it's like, what can I do, is a question that keeps coming up. What is there to do? It seems to me that there's so much we can do, not to get ahead of myself, but there's so much we can do in terms of our own psychology and keeping on working on that. And that's going to have an effect.
I think that may be kind of interesting in terms of what can we do. I think a lot of people who are very sophisticated and even intellectual and on top of things, and I know because I see them sometimes in the psychotherapy setting, haven't been given the means to understand that a lot of what we see in terms of group psychology or fascist tendencies or authoritarian tendencies probably are sourced not just in the MAGA people, but inside of the way that the psyche is organized at this time in human evolution. So I think it might be interesting for us. Look, we're having a whole freaking podcast. We haven't even talked about the Hitler thing. Right. I think it might be as a way to foreground what we're talking about is this idea of what is the psychology of authoritarianism. I mean, how is our psychology either exploited or sculpted for us to, like you said, to not be able to forestall a recreation from 100 years ago or to do something? What is the psychology, let's say, to be sort of simplistic about it, of fascism and authoritarianism?
That's a big question. Yeah, wow. So how to get into that? You mentioned structure. I think that's a really interesting maybe doorway in, is the idea, as I see it, that we have our consciousness, let's say, our awareness, what we're aware of. But then there's so much about our psychology that we may suspect or have some ideas about, kind of intuiting maybe in some ways our unconscious. And then we have layers of the unconscious that we don't know a lot about at all, it seems to me. And so it seems to me there's this dynamism. I mean, this is the idea of psychodynamic psychotherapy, is this dynamism between the conscious and the unconscious. And at its best, that's a beautiful, lovely dance, maybe, or something, or lovemaking. That would be the height of cooperation. But at its probably worse, I think there's some maybe sense of even like murderous intention going on sometimes. There's, maybe there's a way that we could look at it, that the unconscious sometimes wants to take over in a way that sort of murders the conscious. And then similarly, I think that there are ways that the consciousness tries to dominate the unconscious.
I'm glad you brought that in.
Right, in order to try to create some sense of order or stability. And of course, it seems to me, depending on trauma and temperament and all kinds of things, setting even, that there are ways that we can compensate for this dynamism. The consciousness is trying to compensate in a way that's not altogether healthy. In fact, can be really, really unhealthy, seems to me. And so it seems to me that's one way to talk about the idea of fascism or authoritarianism that's built into the structure, if we want to think about consciousness as structure. Does that sound?
Oh, I really like that you brought that in. I thought that was actually done well and very sophisticated. That in order to really understand the psychology of these issues, we have to introduce a hypothesis that their mind is structured. And also I think implied in that notion of structure is that the consciousness is not all-knowing, and in fact may even be myopic about the other factors that are in the structure. I think maybe Freud's sort of basic early contribution, I believe it was right around the interpretation of dreams in 1900, was the topographic model that the mind is like a map, the preconscious, the system unconscious, the system conscious. He would change that to a structural model, which is the id, ego, and the superego. So it's exactly in line, Callum, with what you're saying, that I think a lot of folks don't realize that there's this structural problem. And I loved what you said too, that the unconscious, of course, it's probably more nuanced, but the unconscious is power hungry for good and bad reasons. And then the consciousness is also power hungry for good and bad reasons. So interesting that there's already a power struggle built in to human beings, at least at this stage of our evolution. I thought that was really trenchant, how you put that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm just trying to think, but to maybe get back to your question too about the authoritarianism in the psyche, I'm curious, are there other ways in that you see that we're talking about? I don't know whether that's intrapersonal or interpersonal. I'm sure that there are struggles that are going on. I mean, that's kind of always happening too in terms of an external experience, right? Is that the human being is always in some sort of relationship to the environment. And there's always a struggle to survive, at least it seems. And so
I'm sure there's so many different components. Like one can almost make a mood board. Maybe there's this notion that you're bringing up that vicissitudes, societal pressures, and injustices may also lend to a type of what Nietzsche, the 19th century German philosopher, called ressentiment, or the thing I think we see so much, especially, maybe on the right, which is this culture of grudges, which is really relates. If we get to the Hitler Netflix video, the culture of resentment and rage that followed Germany after World War I seems so completely parallel to the anger that, let's say, the people forgotten in Middle America feel that Trump has exploited, or the Trump movement. But so that's one other issue, that there's probably racism or other factors like homophobia might also make people hungry for a parent or an omniscient figure. That's an interesting point that you're raising as well. It's not just intrapsychic, but interpersonal. Maybe also you referenced earlier issues related to abuse that we never talk about in political discourse, but we learned in the Hitler video. I'm sure there's a better way to call it than that. The Netflix documentary that focused on the circle of Hitler's hench people. That there is make it very clear that Hitler was beaten by his father.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, pretty abusive father, right? Yeah, ongoing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So that is hardly ever talked about. We have all these wonderful books, except maybe Alice Miller, who wrote extensively on child abuse and figures such as Hitler. She has a really good analysis in one of her books. I wish I had access to it right now, that made a correlation between Hitler's, sadism and the violence of the abuse that he suffered under his father. So maybe those are a few additional factors.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very important, I think, to bring that in. Yeah, as you were talking, I was just thinking about the struggle within the family, the struggle to be oneself vis-a-vis a parent. And if that's not done in a, again, a cooperative, nurturing sort of way, there's a struggle that goes on, a power struggle between the child and the parent. And that gets very internalized as a model that then gets projected out onto society. And then, so I think a lot of what we're seeing in terms of the struggle with authoritarianism is the struggle against abusive parenting, and also a desire to be loved by the abusive parent. We see this kind of conflict, I think, that goes back and forth.
Oh my goodness, that's reminds me of Ronald Fairburn, the idea that the abused child for reasons because the abused child has no choice but to deny and dissociate from the abuse received by the parent, that then gets split off and becomes a protectionism of the parent, which
Mm,
then can lend to the abused person over identifying with the abusive politician. And
mhm,
that's a really important analysis by Ronald Fairburn that really deserves a whole, I think, podcast on its own.
mhm,
It's because we just don't really think enough. People have such a stereotype of these simple, armchair psychoanalytic interpretations of serious political problems. But I think we want to illustrate these are really only hypotheses, and they are interrelated with other hypotheses. We want to not disinvite psychology and psychological analysis from our political conversation, but instead to entertain as many different hypotheses as possible. I mean, of course, it stands to reason that who we are today is shaped by our psychology. And of course, it's a very, very basic idea, but it's not one commonly held for some odd reason. Why are we, blessed or cursed with this understanding, Callum? We were, I'm sure, nice gay boys before we got bitten by the psychology bug. And look what good it's gotten us, all the wealth that we have and the power and the fame and the grateful clients. I'm sorry, not to mention all of the suffering you and I have, conjointly undergone. We won't get into that here, but anyway,
today.
sorry. Why are we as the chosen people?
Yeah, really, yeah. Well, that's probably another podcast as well, as maybe the ways that being queer or gay or on the outside of a family unit also opens up a potential for seeing different psychological dynamics that maybe other people don't need to see so much, or maybe not need but aren't required to see so much, let's say.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Plus any maybe astrological placements, but that's way too boo. We won't discuss.
That would be fun.
or issues related to introversion or extroversion, but we won't get into that too. You see, there's so many things that we can talk about,
Many
and
branches.
I think we just really wanted to maybe give the viewing audience a little bit of a taste of the different dimensions that we could cover
Yeah.
using the election news and what felt like a very severe crisis, but now I wonder if it has some more hope for you. And then maybe we can maybe summarize by laying out some of the different strands that we introduced and what we might cover. But yeah, so how do you feel about that? Maybe as giving the audience a taste of the problem of structure, which is a psychodynamic idea. We also might mention that a lot of psychological theories are not actually psychodynamic. People go to CBT therapy or talk therapy, but they're not necessarily as influenced by our interest in the soul or in the unconscious. And that's what we're bringing to this discussion, a interest in the role of the unconscious. And issues related to child abuse, issues related to social stressors, historical factors, even climate, the notion of the common man, the little man, and the resentful man. Anyway, just some thoughts that we already, just without looking at any notes, actually,
Mhm.
we just came up with on the fly.
Yeah, I'm excited about doing several of these, hopefully, together. And should we talk about how that's going to roll out? Is that what you're sort of suggesting here, or?
Yeah. I asked you two questions. How would it roll out? And then how do you feel about the Biden news? But which one should we answer first, do you think?
Um, Let me say about the Biden news. As we were talking about this idea, you mentioned Fairburn and this idea that there's a split, an idealism and a demonization, sort of split between the quote unquote abusive parent, and both needing the parent to be to love the child and the child to love the parent, and also rejecting, the authoritarian parent. And I think we see that a lot we've seen that a lot with both the Biden and the Trump camps. This happens, and they do it opposite, right? Who's the bad parent? Who's the good parent? Who's the devil? Who's the savior? Kind of thing. And I think this is going to be really interesting. As soon as I saw the news this morning that Biden was standing down, I thought this is going to change the whole dynamic. So we're going to have someone emerge, probably Kamala, I'm guessing, but who knows? Who then, does she or that person, do they inherit the Biden projection? Are they able to shake some of that off? So, personally, I'm kind of excited about it. I was, politically speaking, I was pretty much going to vote for anybody who was not Trump. But boy, I don't know if we should put that on the air. Who knows how that could come back to haunt one down the road. But, and at the same time, I think there's a real need to just speak out, speak will to power. But
I think you said something. I was curious to see how Biden was going to, how Kamala was going to receive, and I thought you meant Biden's delegates, but you didn't say that because that was how everyone is talking. You said how Kamala Harris is going to receive Biden's projections. And I thought, I just wanted to point that out. That's a very different approach.
It's a different idea, right?
It's a different idea. So yeah. I thought that was worth, sorry to interrupt, but that was interesting.
Yeah, no, I appreciate your pointing that out, because I do think if we think about it psychologically, she's got a backpack full of Biden in a way, but she also has her own baggage, and when I say baggage, I don't mean either good or bad. I'm not characterizing it that way. And so she's got her own projections onto her, and she represents, I think, something unique, very unique in the political landscape. As a woman of color, highest ranking, in the history of our country. And I think that's going to be pretty interesting to see what she's able to do with her position and her influence if she, gets the delegates. And I'm assuming she will, but who knows how that's going to go.
Right.
Yeah. So anyway, personally, I had some mixed feelings about Biden dropping out. On the one hand, I think that he's done quite a bit of good for the country. There's also another view of all this, which is that anybody in power is going to be power hungry and power mad. And so, to me, they sort of, I don't know, they're the same as us and different in some ways. I keep thinking about it. We all have these power issues. That's what we're talking about here, right? In terms of the Hitler and Trump. And at the same time, they're operating on a whole other level than I think most people in the world.
You can even comprehend, right?
Yeah, it's got to be so different, I would imagine. So, anyway, so in terms of my feelings about it, I'm kind of excited to see where it's going to go, actually. Yeah. And, part of something, too, I'll just throw in here, and again, we can get into this more later, in terms of when we talk about what can we do and losing hope and that sort of thing when scenarios look bleak, I think that there's a way that feelings can come up and sort of take over, like we're talking about, the ability to trap us. They dominate us. At least some of us, definitely me, I get trapped by them sometimes. And what I think I forget, and sometimes other people do too, is that the human spirit is pretty amazing. Human attention is really incredible. Whatever we put our attention to, we affect. And so if a situation looks bleak, what it seems to me what's called for is human attention, are new solutions and new possibilities, and that's part of the imagination. And so I think as bleak as the situation can look around the election for some of us that are more progressively minded, let's say, it's also really, really ripe with possibility. There's so many options, so many different directions that things could go, and to me that's really exciting. So it's a hopeful lens too, optimistic.
Should we talk about what our plans are for the next podcast? We were thinking maybe we would view the Hitler Netflix documentary. Update people about what the history is and maybe related to things that are happening now, but also talk about the psychology.
Mm-hmm.
What do you
So,
think?
yeah, I think so. Now, the thing I was curious about, do we watch that together on screen? Because that would be like, 30, 40 minutes of watching,
I
but
think
people reaction videos and stuff like that. I don't know.
that I think if we had a little bit more technology under our belts, we could be able to do that. It's not a bad idea for future. I was thinking something maybe a little bit more manageable. Like we'd watch. I did last night. Watch episode 1, and then maybe take a few notes, and then organize it perhaps this way, which is summarize the basic points raised in the show,
Hmm.
so that we give its value later, and we give the viewer a bit of a summary of what's in the video, and then we chat, you and I, about what is the psychology that's being referenced. Keep it sort of manageable.
Yeah, that sounds good. I like that.
Okay, cool. All right. I did not pre-think that. I just came up with that right now due to, I'm sure I'm feeling inspired by our conversation.
Uh-huh.
So I think we're at 26 minutes. How about we end here? It's a bit of a teaser and a bit of a sort of contextualizing what we're going to talk about. And how about that's good for today, Callum?
I think that's a great start.
All right, viewers and all of our massive audience members, thank you so much for coming, and we look forward to talking further about all these topics and catching you up on the, I believe, 4 episodes of the Netflix documentary. Until next time, take care.